In our everyday life, grammar is everywhere. We use it constantly, whether it be at home, work, or school. No matter what language it is that you speak, grammar is the very essence of that language. It is what we use to make sense of situations and understandings of what others are saying. English, just as any other language, varies by place to place. Depending on where you are from, determines the vocabulary you may use or how you may pronounce certain words and phrases. Grammar, with all of its rules, exceptions, and grammatical patterns, it is very difficult to pinpoint who exactly invented grammar. Bullicar is the first known grammarian. In the 16th century, he wrote the pamphlet of grammar, which is known as the first English grammar resource. Robert Louth, however, built on from these rules and helped shape many of the rules to grammar that we use today. It was not until the 19th century that people began to really follow these grammar rules. Before this, writers and printers used whatever rules they wanted. Spelling of words were different and were mostly phonetic. Grammar has also advanced over time. The vocabulary we use now is not the same as the vocabulary that our ancestors from long ago used. Due to this constant changing, English has become one of the harder languages to learn. Students often associate grammar with a complicated set of rules and terms instead of an avenue for clear and powerful writing. It is essentially the groundwork for good communication. It is important for us to reflect on our thoughts as expressing how we think and feel. The first step in understanding grammar is to know that grammar is not just speaking or writing, but they both go hand in hand. In order for a student to be clear and concise, we must first have a keen understanding on how to appropriately use our words to get our points across without leaving any misunderstandings. According to Azar, one of the principal benefits of grammar-based teaching is that it helps students gain an understanding of grammar concepts. Concepts such as subordination and coordination, concepts of expressing time relationships through the use of verb forms, concepts of nouns and adjectives, subjects and verbs, clauses and phrases. Students can understand grammar concepts with a simplified terminology with a minimum of meta-language and grammatical analysis, and even without definition of key terms such as noun or verbal. As an educator, it is very important for students that our students are taught the correct way to word their sentences and how to appropriately use words to make sure sentences are correct and are not run-ons, or even misuse punctuation. However, teaching grammar is a steady process. It is important to not overwhelm students with new material, but make sure they have a good understanding of the content at hand and make learning interesting for them. In 1974, the NCTE, a Commission on Composition, stated the study of the structure and history of language, including English grammar, is a valuable asset to a liberal education and an important part of the English program. It should, however, be taught for its own sake, not as a substitute for composition and not the pretense that it is taught only to improve writing. The goal for teaching grammar is not to only show how language works, but also guide students how to use it correctly. The most effective way to teach grammar is to do it in such a way that it draws the students' attention so they can comprehend it and students are eager to learn. Acquiring language without knowledge to use it appropriately is setting your students up for failure. Richards and Rondeo point out two good reasons for teaching grammar. The first one is comprehensibility. Knowing how to build and use certain structures make it possible to communicate common types of meaning successfully. Without these structures, it is difficult to make comprehensible sentences. We must therefore try to identify these structures and teach them well. The second is acceptability. In some social contexts, serious deviance from native speaker norms can hinder integration and excite prejudice. A person who speaks badly may not be taken seriously or may be considered uneducated or stupid. Students may therefore want or need a higher level of grammatical correctness than is required for mere comprehensibility. Grammar is a key concept in general linguistic theory. Grammar is not a simple subject to learn. In order for a teacher to successfully aid their students in learning grammar, it has many rules and conditions that we typically kind of break into pieces. What is meant by breaking it into pieces? Typically, when educators first start teaching grammar, they start with nouns and verbs and how to differentiate between the two. As time progresses with students, you start with their sentence structures, which is where it begins to get a little complicated with students. Sometimes students overthink the process too much. Instead of paying attention to what is actually being asked, or they are unfamiliar with some of the terminology used in dissecting of sentences. The goal is for students to not just memorize material while the teacher is just on a specific subject in grammar, but they need to internalize it. Student-centered learning is the key to students mastering grammar. When you make a lesson based around your students and not yourself, that is when you will see improvements. When the student becomes engaged, they are more willing to grasp the meaning of the lesson. However, this does not mean the teacher should disregard teaching the lesson, but should break down the lesson into steps. Research shows that some people have more analytical learning styles than others. According to Hatch in 1974, some learners approach the language learning task as rule formers. Such learners are accurate but halting users of the target language. Others are what Hatch calls data gatherers, fluent but inaccurate producers of the target language. Two of the most frequently used methodologies to teach grammar are the deductive and inductive approaches. In the deductive approach, many times the teacher will discuss the grammar rule and then give exercises to show how you apply the rule. This helps the teacher in covering more rules, and it helps the teacher save time by covering more areas. It also gives teachers the ability to discuss different points in the language as they come up. The drawback to the deductive approach is that if students or grammar learners do not have the meta-language in order to talk about language, the inductive approach, the teacher gives examples of the language, and students have to come up with their own understanding. This typically makes the lessons have more meaning and the concept is better grasped. However, this method can also be detrimental to a student if they come up with the wrong rule or if they are slow in finding out the rule. The first step in teaching grammar is to present the lesson to the class. The teacher should make sure to give the class a good background knowledge on what it is they need to know and make sure they understand the vocabulary that is dealing with the grammar lesson. For instance, if a teacher's lesson is about adjectives and adverbs, the students will need to understand what an adjective is and why this is important in their writing and everyday speech. A teacher may begin with writing a sentence on the board that does not have any adjectives. Then they may rewrite the sentence, but this time adding a few adjectives and adverbs into it. The teacher will then be able to compare the two and see the differences in the two. The teacher may go as far as asking kids to close their eyes as he or she reads the first sentence and have the kids visualize it, and then repeat this step with the sentence that has been modified. Then see if the students can tell you the difference with all the descriptive words added. However, a student cannot master one form of grammar structure at a time, like they can with most other subjects. Grammar is complex in that it is always adding on to what is being previously taught. The second step to this lesson would be to practice what you just taught your students. You can give them papers where it is fill in the blanks that has to do with your grammar lesson. Whether it's from an excerpt of a story the class has been reading, or you take the adjectives or adverbs from lines of the story and have kids fill them back in. You can also take the excerpt from the story and give it to the students and have them dissect the sentence. They can circle where the noun and verb are, and then delving deeper, the students can underline the adverbs and highlight the adjectives. The last step is applying. If we continue on with our lesson with adverbs, you can have students give an example of an adverb and have them give aloud a few examples to what they came up with. Next, you can write down adverbs on an index card for your students to act out. Then you can have the students come up with a few of their own questions or things that they can do, like brush teeth, reading, hanging out with friends, etc. You will be able to keep the adverbs and actions separate and have students draw out from each bag. Then have the students volunteer to pick one from each bag and act it out, like hum happily. While the volunteer is doing this, the other students should be trying to guess what the volunteer is doing. The goal with learning grammar is that the students should adapt these rules subconsciously when speaking or writing. Not only is breaking it into pieces going step by step to find the best way to convey your message to your students, but it also breaks down each piece of information that they learn. A teacher is not going to start out with teaching students about compound, complex sentences when the student does not have any knowledge on complex or even compound sentences. Grammar is not a subject that is automatically known, but is something that has to be taught. Without grammar, we would be unable to effectively communicate with each other. It would end up being pure chaos if there were no rules for grammar. It was assumed that we automatically understood the concept of grammar. According to Zhang, that would make communicating with one another ineffective. When there are no standards for us to go on, language knowledge of grammar and vocabulary is the base of English language. According to Dr. Mayer, specific methods for teaching grammar appears to have an effect on comprehension strategies. Strategies that teach sentence combining, a long-time favorite within the special education literature, appears to help students understand what they read. Probably because it helps students understand how sentences work. Other research suggests that being familiar with the vocabulary of grammar, like nouns and adjectives, benefits students' understanding. Grammatical instruction paves the way for speech. Without grammar, sentences would be like a jigsaw puzzle trying to figure out the meaning out of something so incoherent when you first read it. For example, Miley sit table. A person may be able to read that and still understand basic concepts of the sentence, but it's obvious the sentence is missing structure and fluency. Many times, people who have a low level of grammar accuracy seem to consider not as intelligent. If a person is overheard talking correctly subconsciously, our mind holds them in a higher standard than someone who spoke the example sentence above. The more students learn grammar, the more complex thinking they are able to do as well as write. Grammar is not only helping in one another's vocabulary, but aiding in their writing abilities. Being able to turn simple sentences into compound, complex, or even compound, complex sentences, having the ability to do this greatly helps their writing in being able to correctly change these. It also helps in making reading and conversation not so choppy and robotic sounding. The conversation will flow smoother than it did before. Not only is it important to have good grammar to speak better, but also have better comprehension. There are 5 fundamental elements of grammar: punctuation, tense, word order, determiners, and connectors. These 5 elements work together to create meaning, and when any of them are used incorrectly, meaning can be changed or lost. If used incorrectly, they can completely change the meaning of a sentence, which can cause the person saying or writing the sentence to lose their point in what they were initially saying. Changing something small, such as the punctuation, can cause a sentence to come across in a completely different way than intended. For example, Sally went to the shop to buy an ice cream. With a period as the punctuation, this sentence is just a statement. But if a question mark was substituted for the period and the sentence became, Sally went to the shop for ice cream, it makes the sentence have a tone like Sally is being questioned. Correctly using punctuation can allow the writer and reader to set specific tones in their stories to help writing have a better flow to it. Correct grammar is not only limited to speaking and writing, but also reading. If an author correctly uses grammar within their story, it flows smoothly. Now, if they only use simple sentences, too many commas where they did not need to be, or the wrong tense in the writing, it becomes complicated and a little robotic. Having the ability to maintain your work from having run-on sentences or incorrect use of homophones allows for the readers to have a better reading experience. They are not having to stop and constantly think of what the writer might be trying to say. It increases the fluency of the sentence at hand without any inaccurate meanings. Not all researchers find there to be a correlation between grammar study and writing, though. Chen believes that as students revise and edit their writing, teachers can provide grammar instruction that guides students in their attempts to identify and correct problems in sentence structure and usage. For example, a teacher who sees that many students are writing sentences containing misplaced modifiers can present a MIDI lesson on this concept using examples from student writing. The teacher can have students edit their own and one another's drafts from this problem. Integrating grammar instruction into the revising and editing process helps students make an immediate applications, thus allowing them to see relevance of grammar to their own writing. Grammar rules can be so complicated and hard to use, you may wonder why we even have them at all. The reason behind it is that such rules created by linguists in order to explain language phenomena. You may ask yourself, why is grammar so important? Teaching grammar in context will help learners acquire new grammar structures and forms. Learners will use grammatical conventions more effectively in communication. It becomes less about technique but more about the philosophy behind it as you continue to teach about grammar. Being knowledgeable in grammar in return makes the student a better writer and more likely to be considered for other opportunities in life. Even though correct grammar does not happen overnight, it is a process that one has to constantly work on and is ever changing, along with grammar mastery comes.